The first thing I saw was my "No Trespassing" sign floating face down in the creek, bumping against the rocks like it was trying to crawl away from the mess someone had made. The second thing I heard was laughter. Not kids laughing, not somebody passing by, but grown adults laughing from the bend behind my property line. And the third thing I remember thinking was, well, there it is. The day my quiet little piece of land stopped being quiet, I had moved out to the edge of Pine Hollow, a sleepy little town about 20 minutes outside Chattanooga, because I was done with noise, done with people measuring their worth by the square footage of their kitchen islands, done with neighbors who knew more about your trash cans than your actual life. My place was not fancy. It was an old, cedar-sided house with a gravel drive, a crooked porch, and a strip of spring-fed creek that ran along the back pasture before disappearing into a patch of cottonwoods. That creek was the reason I bought the place. The real estate agent had said it like a bonus, like, "Oh, and by the way, you get water rights." But to me, that was the whole dream. I wanted coffee on the porch, boots in the mud, no meetings, no committees, no one telling me what color my shutters were supposed to be. And most importantly, I was not part of the Briargate HOA, which sat on the other side of the old service road with its matching mailboxes, trimmed hedges, and people who waved with only 3 fingers because a 4-hand apparently showed too much emotional availability. I knew I was outside their boundary because I checked. Twice. I had the survey, the deed, the county plat map, even a letter from the title company confirming my parcel was independent. But none of that seemed to matter to Judith Bellamy. Judith was the president of Briargate, late 50s, pearl earrings at 9 in the morning, hair sprayed into a shape that looked legally binding, and always walking around with a leather folder tucked under her arm like she was about to close on a hostile takeover of your front lawn. The first time she showed up, I was unloading moving boxes, sweating through an old Braves t-shirt, and she stood at the end of my driveway with this polite little smile that had absolutely no warmth in it. She said, "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Walker. We do like to keep things consistent around here." I told her I appreciated that, and I went back to carrying a box labeled kitchen, which actually had extension cords and 1 frying pan in it because moving is basically lying to yourself with cardboard. 2 days later, there was a notice in my mailbox saying my driveway gravel was too light in tone. A week after that, another notice said my shed roof was visually disrupted from the walking trail. Then came a warning about my mailbox height, even though my mailbox had probably been there since the Clinton administration and looked like it had survived at least 1 emotional divorce. Every time, I walked the paper back over to Judith or one of her little board disciples and said the same thing, nice and calm, "I am not in your HOA." And every time, she gave me that smile, that same tight, waxy smile, and said something like, "Well, boundaries can be more complicated than people think." Now, I should have taken that sentence more seriously, because looking back, that was not a neighbor being confused. That was a warning. Judith did not like the fact that there was 1 house at the edge of Briargate she could not control, 1 strip of land she could not find, 1 person who could look at her stamp letterhead and say no. And what made it worse was the creek. Briargate had a little walking loop that came close to my backline, and for years, residents had treated the sound of the water like it belonged to them, even though the actual creek turned onto my parcel before the prettiest stretch, the part with the flat stones, the shade, and the little pool deep enough to cool your feet in July. I did not know it at the time, but people in the neighborhood had been complaining for years that the developer had promised them creek access, which is a funny word, promised, because it can mean anything from written into a legal document to some guy in khakis saying sure, probably, while trying to sell houses. Whatever they thought they had been promised, they did not have it. The county records were clear. My side of the creek was mine. So when I saw that no trespassing sign drifting downstream that Saturday morning, my stomach did this slow little drop, because I already knew whose fingerprints were probably all over it. I followed the water along the bank, stepping over roots and wet leaves, and when I came around the bend, I found the most entitled picnic I had ever seen in my life. Judith Bellamy was sitting in a canvas folding chair on my creek bank, wearing white pants, next to a muddy creek, which told me everything I needed to know about her relationship with consequences. Beside her were 2 board members, a retired dentist named Martin Greer, and a woman named Susan Pike who always looked like she was smelling smoke but did not want to be rude about it. They had a cooler, 3 fishing rods, a Bluetooth speaker playing soft country music, and a little wooden sign stuck in the dirt that said Briargate Creek Commons. Creek Commons. I just stood there for a second, because sometimes anger takes a moment to arrive when the stupidity is that large. Then I cleared my throat. Martin jumped, Susan froze, and Judith turned around slowly, like I was the one interrupting her on property she owned. She smiled and said, "Oh, Daniel, good. I was hoping we could talk." I looked at the fishing line in the water, then at the sign, then back at her. "Judith, you are sitting on my land." She gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they want to make your concern sound childish. "We are not trying to be difficult. The community voted last month to designate this section for limited recreational enjoyment." I said, "The community voted on my creek?" Martin cleared his throat and looked away, because even he seemed to hear how insane that sounded when said out loud. Judith folded her hands in her lap and said, "The creek has always been part of the neighborhood identity." I said, "So is gossip, but I do not see you putting up a plaque for that." Susan made a little noise, maybe a cough, maybe a laugh she swallowed too late. Judith's smile disappeared for half a second, then came back sharper. She said, "Daniel, this kind of attitude is exactly why people are uncomfortable approaching you. You moved into a community, whether you acknowledge it or not, and that right there, that sentence, hit the nerve. Because I had not moved into a community, I had moved next to one. And there is a world of difference between being a neighbor and being absorbed like some unwitting suburb organ donor." I told her to pack up and leave. She told me I was escalating. I told her I was calling the sheriff. She stood up then, slow and dramatic, brushing invisible dirt off her white pants, and said, "You may want to be careful. Once legal review starts, people often discover their property rights are not as absolute as they believed." It was meant to scare me. It almost worked, not because I believed her, but because competent people with folders have a way of making normal people question reality for half a second. But then I looked at my broken sign in the weeds, looked at their little fake Creek Commons marker, and something in me went quiet. Not calm exactly, more like when a storm stops moving for one breath before it hits. I did not yell. I did not threaten. I just said, "You have 10 minutes. Then I turned around and walked back to the house, with Judith calling after me, "This conversation is not over." And she was right. It was not over. Not even close. Because what she did not know was that 2 months before I moved in, after somebody stole copper wiring from the barn, I had installed cameras along the entire back line, motion activated, night vision, stored locally on a hard drive in my office. So while Judith thought she had just won another little neighborhood power game, I was walking inside to make coffee, open my laptop, and find out exactly how long they had been treating my land like theirs. I sat down at my desk with my coffee still steaming beside the keyboard. And I remember my hand hovering over the mouse for a second, because part of me honestly did not want to know. There's a strange comfort in being angry at what you can see, because once you start looking backward, once you start asking how long this has been happening, anger turns into something heavier. I opened the camera folder from the back pasture and started with that morning. There they were, plain as day. Judith walking ahead like she was leading a ribbon-cutting ceremony, Martin carrying the cooler, Susan carrying the little wooden Briargate Creek Commons sign, all 3 of them stepping around my post-it markers like those signs were suggestions for other people. At first I almost laughed, because it was so clean, so stupidly clear. Then I clicked back a few days, then a week, then 3 weeks, and that is when the whole thing stopped being funny. The first clip that made my stomach tighten was from a Wednesday morning at 8:43. Judith came down the trail with 2 men I did not recognize, both wearing work gloves, one carrying a shovel, the other dragging a bag of mulch over his shoulder. They walked along my bank, pointed at the ground, talked for a few minutes, then started clearing brush, not fallen branches, not trash brush, my brush on my land. The next clip was worse. Martin showed up with a cordless saw and cut down 2 small willows near the waterline. Not big trees, nothing dramatic enough for a lumberjack documentary, but they were holding the bank together, and he just sliced through them while Judith stood there with her hands on her hips, nodding like a project manager. Then came gravel, bags of it, dumped along the muddy slope to make a little path. Then came a rope tied to a sycamore limb over the deeper pool. Then came kids, 8 or 9 of them, splashing in the creek while adults stood around with canned drinks, laughing, filming on their phones, telling them to take turns on the swing. I watched one boy slip on the rocks and land hard on his hip, and one of the adults just yelled, "You're fine," like that somehow erased the fact that if he had cracked his head open, the ambulance would have been coming to my address. I sat there with my coffee gone cold, looking at the screen, and all I could think was, they turned my property into a liability trap and did not even have the decency to be sneaky about it. That was the moment my anger got very quiet. I made 3 copies of the footage, one on the computer, one on an external drive, one on a thumb drive I put in the junk drawer under a stack of takeout menus, because when people are arrogant enough to steal land with a committee vote, you do not assume they will behave honorably once they are caught. Then I called my cousin, Marissa Cole, who was technically not my cousin by blood, but in the South, anybody who has been at enough Thanksgiving tables and knows where your grandmother hides the good pie plates becomes family. Marissa was a real estate attorney in Knoxville, and before that she had worked in the county prosecutor's office, which meant she had the gift of sounding bored right before ruining someone's week. I told her the short version. She asked me to send everything 10 minutes after I uploaded the clips. She called back and said, "Danny, I need you to listen carefully. Do not talk to Judith again without me. Do not argue with the board. Do not post anything online. And absolutely do not touch anything they installed." I said, "So this is bad?" She gave this tiny laugh. "No, this is useful. Bad is when you have no proof. You have a documentary." By noon, I had also called the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office. A deputy named Aaron Delgado came out a few hours later. A broad-shouldered guy with tired eyes and the calm voice of someone who had heard every possible version of grown adults acting like raccoons in golf shirts. I showed him the deed first, then the survey, then the camera footage. He did not say much while it played. He leaned one hand on the back of my chair, jaw tight, watching Judith and her little board crew cut, dig, drag, tie, dump, and invite half the neighborhood onto land they did not own. When the clip ended, he stepped back and said, "Well, that is not a misunderstanding," I said. "Can I make them leave?" He looked toward the window, toward the creek, then back at me. "You can press charges, trespass, property damage, maybe reckless endangerment depending on how the county attorney sees that rope swing. But hey, I'm going to tell you something. Once I write this up, it may get bigger than a neighbor dispute." I said, "Good," and I meant it, but my voice sounded smaller than I expected. Because there is a difference between wanting someone stopped and realizing you are the person who has to stop them. Marissa came the next morning, wearing jeans, boots, and a blazer, which is basically lawyer armor for rural property law. She walked the creek line with me, took pictures, measured from the survey markers, and paused at the stump where Martin had cut the willows. She crouched down, touched the fresh cut, then looked up at me and said, "They did not think you would fight." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was complicated, but because it was so obviously true. Judith had not misread the map. She had read me, or at least she thought she had. She saw a guy living alone at the edge of the neighborhood. No HOA, no wife on the garden committee, no kids on the swim team, no social reason to push back in public. And she decided I was easier to pressure than persuade. That is the thing about people like Judith. They do not always start with evil plans. Sometimes they start with entitlement, then they wrap it in community language, then they get praised for being proactive, and after a while they cannot tell the difference between service and control. Marissa pulled the Briargate governing documents from the county that afternoon, and that was the first real crack in Judith's little empire. My parcel was not listed, not adjacent member, not associate member, not legacy access, nothing. Briargate had authority over Briargate lots, and my land was as outside their jurisdiction as a gas station in Nebraska. Then Marissa found something better, or worse, depending on which side of the lawsuit you were standing on. 3 of the notices Judith had sent me included language implying I could be fined for non-compliance. One even stated that continued refusal might result in legal recovery actions by the association. Marissa read that line out loud at my kitchen table, then smiled in a way that made me glad she was on my side. She said, "That is not just overreach. That is them representing authority they do not have." I said, "So, fraud?" She tilted her hand. "Potentially. At minimum, deceptive. Definitely ugly in front of a judge." We filed the civil complaint 2 days later. Property damage, trespass, unauthorized alteration, nuisance, restoration costs, legal fees. Deputy Delgado filed his report. and the sheriff's office contacted the people visible on camera. I expected things to get tense. I expected Judith to send one of her chilly little letters. What I did not expect was the neighborhood to start leaking stories like a dam with cracks in it. The first person was my neighbor across the service road, an older widower named Earl Whitcomb, who had lived there since before Briargate was even a drawing on a developer's brochure. He stopped by while I was fixing the latch on my gate, leaned on the fence, and said, "Heard you finally poked the queen bee." I said, "I am starting to think the queen bee poked me first." He laughed and told me Judith had tried to bill him years earlier for road beautification even though his driveway connected to a county road, not Briargate. Then came Alicia Moreno, a single mom from the cul-de-sac, who brought over a folder of fines for leaving a basketball hoop visible from the street. Then a young couple, Ben and Haley, showed me emails threatening legal action over a vegetable garden that was apparently too visible, too tall, and, according to one note, inconsistent with the intended lifestyle character of the community, which is the kind of sentence only someone drunk on authority and herbal tea could write. I started scanning everything. Marissa told me to keep it organized, so I made a digital folder called Judith's Greatest Hits, which she said was legally unprofessional but emotionally understandable. Within a week, we had letters, fines, board emails, photos, and meeting minutes that painted a very clear picture. The creek was not some one-time mistake, it was part of a pattern. Judith had been expanding Briargate's influence inch by inch for years, leaning on people who either did not know the rules or did not have the energy to fight. And then came the emergency meeting. Briargate held it on a Thursday night at the clubhouse, a brick building with fake shutters and a sign out front that said "Community is our foundation," which felt a little rich given the circumstances. I did not attend. Marissa did. Deputy Delgado was there as an observer, and Earl went because, in his words, "I want to see her face when the balloon pops." According to Marissa, Judith opened the meeting by saying there had been an unfortunate misunderstanding involving a neighboring parcel and that certain individuals were attempting to weaponize technicalities against the community. That is when Marissa stood up. She did not yell. She did not perform. She simply handed printed packets to the board and said, "For the record, Mr. Walker's property is not part of Briargate. Your association has no jurisdiction over his land. Your members entered it repeatedly, altered it physically, damaged vegetation, installed recreational equipment, and invited children onto the premises without permission. You also issued written enforcement notices implying legal authority over a non-member parcel. That ends tonight." I wish I had seen Judith's face. I really do. Because Earl later described it as a woman swallowing a lemon and a lawsuit at the same time. Martin tried to say he thought the creek access had been approved years ago. Susan claimed she was only following board guidance. Judith said, "Our residents have always understood that area as shared amenity space." Marissa replied, "Then your residents were misinformed by someone with a responsibility to know better." That line apparently landed so hard the room went silent. And silence. In a room full of homeowners who had been fined for mailbox fonts and holiday wreath sizes can be a dangerous thing. Because once people saw Judith challenged and not magically protected by the universe, they started asking questions. Who approved the gravel? Who paid for the rope swing? Why were notices being sent outside the HOA boundary? Why had the board never clarified the creek access in writing? Why were residents told Jews supported amenity improvements that, as it turned out, were not on HOA land? By the end of the meeting, Martin had resigned from the Recreation Committee. Susan was crying in the hallway, and Judith was refusing to answer questions without counsel, which was probably the first smart thing she had done all year. The next morning, the rope swing was gone. By lunch, someone had removed the Creek Common sign. By evening, two men were down by the bank with buckets, trying to scoop gravel out of the mud as if restoration worked like erasing pencil. But it was too late. The sheriff's report was already filed. The county had been notified. Marissa had the footage. And for the first time since I moved there, Briargate was not sending me a notice. They were waiting for one. For about 48 hours after that meeting, the whole neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. Nobody from Briargate came near my driveway. Nobody taped another notice to my mailbox. Nobody wandered down toward the creek with a folding chair and a fake sense of destiny. And I would love to tell you I enjoyed the peace, but honestly, I kept waiting for the next stupid thing to drop out of the sky. And it did, just not from Judith. At least not directly. Deputy Delgado called me on Monday morning and said the county planning office wanted to walk the creek line because the report mentioned grading, gravel, and bank disturbance near a protected runoff channel. That sounded serious in the way government words always sound serious, like you are already in trouble and just waiting for someone to choose the font. A county inspector named Lyle Hammond showed up that afternoon, wearing work boots, a faded ball cap, and the expression of a man who had seen too many people build things where water was supposed to go. He walked the bank slowly, took pictures of the gravel path, measured the stump line, looked at the disturbed mud near the sycamore, then stood there staring across the creek toward Briargate's walking loop. I asked him if I was about to get fined for something they did. He looked over at me and said, "Not if the paperwork matches the footage." Then he gave this little dry smile and added, "And from what I have seen, Mr. Walker, your paperwork is a lot cleaner than theirs." That was the first time I felt the ground shift under the story. Until then, I thought we were dealing with trespassing, damage, maybe some fines, maybe a settlement. But Lyle explained that the gravel they dumped had narrowed a natural runoff path, and if heavy rain pushed water wrong, it could wash sediment into a protected drainage basin downstream. Then he asked a question that made Marissa go very still. He asked, "Do you know who authorized the pedestrian improvement project on the East Greenbelt?" I said, "The what?" Turns out, Briargate had filed paperwork months earlier for small amenity improvements near the creek. Benches, trail edging, observation points. Harmless-sounding stuff, the kind of language that makes a bad idea look like a grant proposal. The problem was, some of those improvements were not on HOA land. One little community garden had been pushed onto county property, a stone border had been installed over a drainage easement, and the creek path on my site, the one Judith had treated like a personal summer camp, had been listed in internal meeting notes as future shared access pending owner cooperation. Owner cooperation. That was me, apparently, and nobody had asked me to cooperate. Unless you count white pants and a fishing rod as formal negotiation, Marissa requested copies of the permits, reimbursement records, board minutes, and vendor invoices, and once those papers started arriving, the whole thing got ugly in a way that made the creek dispute look almost quaint. There were invoices from a landscaping company called Southridge Outdoor Services, which sounded normal, until Earl told me the company belonged to Martin Greer's brother-in-law. There were reimbursements for trail maintenance tools nobody could find, safety rail materials that had never been installed, consulting fees for environmental review from a business that shared an address with Susan Pike's vacation rental. It was like pulling one loose thread and realizing the whole sweater was made of lies. Judith, meanwhile, had gone quiet, which was somehow more unsettling than her threats. No letters, no speeches, no surprise visits. Just silence from the woman who used to believe every porch light and flower pot in a half-mile radius required her personal blessing. Then, 2 weeks after the meeting, I woke up to the sound of tires on wet pavement and saw 2 sheriff's cruisers roll past my house toward Briargate. I did not follow them. I did not need to. By then, the neighborhood group chat was moving faster than a tornado siren. Earl texted me one sentence. They got her. Judith Bellamy was arrested just after 7 in the morning, standing in her doorway in a robe, hair not yet sprayed into command position, no folder, no pearls, no polished voice telling everybody else how things were going to be. And I know it is not noble to admit this, but there was a small, petty part of me that pictured her realizing, maybe for the first time in years, that official-looking paper can go both directions. Martin was charged later that week. Susan cut a deal. Or that was the rumor anyway, and started handing over emails faster than anyone expected. The charges sounded bigger than anything I'd imagined when I first saw that sign floating in the creek: falsifying association records, misappropriation of funds, conspiracy to defraud, unauthorized land alteration, and in Judith's case, using enforcement notices to misrepresent legal authority over non-member property. My civil case settled before trial because their insurance carrier wanted nothing to do with a jury watching footage of retirees building a secret park on some guy's land. I got restoration costs, legal fees, damages for the trees, and a court order that required Briargate to publish a plain language boundary notice to every resident. Marissa called it a beautiful little paragraph of humiliation. It said the association had no authority over my parcel, no rights to the creek, and no ability to regulate, access, improve, maintain, or otherwise interfere with my property. I framed a copy and put it in my office. Not because I am petty, but because sometimes interior decorating is about healing. For a while, it looked like that would be the end. The old board was removed after residents petitioned under Briargate's own bylaws, which felt poetic enough to make even Marissa smile. A temporary board came in, froze all fines, opened the books, and held a meeting where people actually got to ask questions without being treated like disobedient children. The creek bank was restored. The gravel was hauled out. The willows were replaced with native plantings. I put up new signs, not laminated this time, real metal ones bolted into cedar posts, because apparently in America you have to build your boundaries like you were expecting medieval siege equipment. And then, 3 months later, just when the cicadas came back and the whole thing started to feel like a story I could tell without my blood pressure climbing, I got a certified letter from the county tax assessor. It said my parcel had been flagged for an unreported recreational structure. Attached was a blurry aerial photo showing a small wooden platform near the far bend of the creek. I stared at it for a long time, confused because I'd not built anything. Then I looked closer and realized the platform was not on my land. It was on the county greenbelt just beyond my back corner, but the permit number attached to it listed my parcel ID. I called Marissa, and before I finished the sentence, she said, "Danny, that is fraud again." This time, there was no slow unraveling. The county pulled drone footage, permit logs, and contractor records within days. Somebody from the temporary board had tried to push through one final project using old discretionary funds, filing under my parcel ID to avoid greenbelt restrictions and tagging the plans as a wildlife observation deck. On the railing, in the photo, there was a little sign that said Briargate Nature Point. I almost admired the stupidity. Almost. Deputy Delgado stood beside me when the county crew came to remove it, and he just shook his head. "Some folks lose power and still keep reaching for the switch," he said. That platform was gone in 72 hours. The remaining HOA accounts were frozen. The county opened a formal review, and by winter, Briargate, as everyone had known it, was gone. Not rebranded. Not reorganized. Gone. Its charter was revoked. Shared assets were transferred under county supervised management, and the enforcement arm that had terrorized people over gravel cutters and garden height simply stopped existing. The entrance sign still says Briargate, but now it just means a neighborhood, not a kingdom. As for me, I still live by that creek. I still drink coffee on the porch in the morning. The new willows are taking root. The water runs clear again, and every now and then I see Earl walking the road with his old dog, giving me a two-finger salute like we survived a war nobody outside the neighborhood would believe. And maybe that is the part that stayed with me most. Not the arrests, not the lawsuit, not even watching Judith's little empire fold in on itself, but realizing how many people had been quietly living under rules they never questioned because the person enforcing them sounded confident. That is how control sneaks in. It does not always kick down the door. Sometimes it arrives as the notice, a meeting, a polite reminder, a phrase like community standards, and if nobody asks who gave you the right, it grows legs and starts walking across property lines. So if you take anything from my story, take this. Know what you own. Keep your documents. Save the emails. Put things in writing. And when somebody tells you a committee voted to take what is yours, do not argue with the performance. Check the paperwork. Because sometimes the only thing standing between your quiet life and someone else's little kingdom is one person willing to say no. And now I want to hear from you. Was I right to push it as far as I did? Or should I have tried harder to settle it quietly before the whole HOA collapsed? Have you ever dealt with a neighbor, a board, a landlord, or some self-appointed authority figure who thought confidence was the same thing as law? Drop your story in the comments, because I read them, and I have a feeling the wildest neighborhood wars are the ones happening behind the cleanest fences.